Welcome back to California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We're in Sacramento today, the state's capital. We are joined by Chris McKenzie. He is the executive director of the League of California Cities. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. For our viewers that aren't familiar with the League, what exactly is it?
The League is the State Association of Cities. It was founded in 1898 to train city officials and help them learn from each other, but also to advocate for them before the state legislature and Congress.
Give us a sense of how large cities are in terms of the overall makeup of the state. You know,
Sure.
If you're on the coast, it feels very urban, but there's a lot of area without cities.
Sure.
So give us a sense.
Well, I can talk about it in terms of population. Sure. We've got a statewide population of over 37 million. 83% or 82% of the people of California live in cities. So we are an urban state when it comes to where people choose to live. We obviously have a lot of unincorporated territory, though.
Right. But people aren't living necessarily in those
Correct.
large swaths of unincorporated area.
Correct.
I think it's fair to say that over the last decade or so, there has been a bit of tension between Sacramento and local governments. Some could argue the counties are facing more challenges with Sacramento than cities. But talk to us about the dance most generally between Sacramento and cities and counties.
Well, there is some understandable tension and always will be between
Right.
local governments and the state, because local governments believe they're, as the government closest to the people,
Right.
that they should have local control, or what we call home rule. State legislators often want to impose rules or even restrict the funding streams of cities, and that's where the tension arises. So over the last 10 years, we've been involved in a couple of ballot measures which have been designed, successfully I might add, for the most part, to restrict the ability of the legislature to take the tax funds of local governments
Right.
and to redirect them.
It's interesting. One would have thought that in an era of term limits, more turnover in the legislature, likely more members coming from local government, from city councils, from counties, that they may be more amenable, more favorable to the position of local government. Sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't.
Sometimes it does. And
Right.
I think we have to remember that state legislators have a new job.
Right.
They represent a larger area. They have a state budget now, not a city budget.
Right.
And so we do remind them of their local roots. Many times that does work. But other times, including sometimes very legitimately, they have to make decisions differently.
I want to speak about an issue that is on the top of mind for so many because of what we see throughout the nation. It deals with marijuana policy. We know Colorado recently legalized marijuana, as did Washington State. The rules in California continue to frustrate because
Right.
you have voters indicating they would like to see the medical use of marijuana. You have the decriminalization of marijuana. At the same time, you have some cities banning it. You have other cities trying to limit it. Where's the league on this?
Well, where we are, and we in fact this year provided a lot of leadership and continue to on the issue, is that we're advocating for a compatible state and local regulatory system which will clarify the rules for everybody. The users, which have a right to use, the qualified users who have medical needs for the product, for the dispensaries and the cultivators, and for law enforcement, which, by the way, probably has the toughest job, trying to enforce local rules and without any help from a state government that in many cases is the only level of government that will have the stick in certain circumstances.
When we come back, I want to continue this conversation, especially in the wake of a recent Supreme Court decision coming out of the city of Riverside, and see how proposed legislation will interact with that decision. For our viewers on HLN, I want to thank you so much for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back with Chris McKenzie. So, sir, as you know, the California Supreme Court recently came out with a ruling coming out of the city of Riverside. And what Riverside had done is they had passed a ban on medical marijuana dispensaries, citing zoning ordinances. Not commenting on Proposition 216?
215.
215, but really
Right.
focused on zoning. And the Supreme Court agreed with Riverside.
Correct.
That as a matter of zoning, they can make that decision, that they don't want medical marijuana dispensaries in city limits. What's the league's position as it relates to that and the proposed regulation coming out of the state Senate, Lou Correa's Bill 1262?
Well, we supported both the Supreme Court's decision, actually filed a brief in the case. For the 200 or so cities that want to use their zoning power, which is granted to them by the Constitution, by the way, to restrict or limit these kinds of facilities, we fight for their right to do that. And SB 1262 by Senator Correa also respects their right. But for the more than 50 which want to regulate it and allow it, we also advocate for their right to do that and to have the proper tools to do it. So SB 1262 is designed to support both types of communities, those that don't want it to be allowed and those who want it to be allowed and to be sold safely and appropriately, which has been where we've had a big problem.
I'm wondering if, I understand that the Supreme Court focused on the zoning side, but the voters spoke pretty clearly with Prop 215 that they wanted individuals with medical needs to have access.
Right.
And if you live in an area, a rural area, where, for example, the cities in that area have voted as a matter of zoning to exclude medical marijuana clinics, those people just may not have access, legitimate access.
They, of course, have access in other jurisdictions nearby that do allow it, but they also have the right to grow it themselves.
That is true.
Their caregiver can cultivate it and provide it to them. These ordinances aren't interfering with their personal cultivation and consumption. What they're saying is, as a business activity, we do not want to have medical marijuana cultivation sites or dispensaries or a distribution facility, which is, by the way, necessary in this whole scheme. And if those are going to exist, they ought to exist in communities that allow it, and it ought to be regulated by the state and by the cities.
And let's talk about the proposed regulation.
Okay.
As I understand it, and help me out, the dispensary would need to get local approval, and then once they get local approval, they then would get a state license, which would allow them to operate?
Yes, they need both a local approval, typically a business license,
Sure.
and they also need a state license, and there are rules that will accompany both of those licenses in order to ensure that the product is safely stored, safely delivered to
Right.
the operation, safely stored, and safely sold to the customers.
Do you anticipate that these two layers of regulation will be beneficial? You know, one could argue we're already a high regulation state. Why do we need double layers?
Actually, we've got support from different medical marijuana groups for the legislation because they, like us, believe it will clarify the rules, it will provide predictability to both law enforcement and to the consumers of the products and the sellers of the products. It will ensure much higher safety of the sale and the product itself.
I found it fascinating that just city after city after city, I'm going to hold this up, is in support of this legislation. I mean, this is a nice long list of cities. Sir, how'd you do that?
Well, our members concluded that they agreed it was time to clarify the rules, and so they weighed in support of the bill. That tells us that we've hit that sweet spot with our own membership. But to have advocates for medical marijuana also supporting the legislation is very gratifying.
There is likely going to be an initiative on the ballot at some point in the next 2, 4, 6 years that would do what Colorado and Washington did. Where do cities go with that?
Well, we haven't had that conversation because the issue has not become real yet. But many of the same issues are going to arise. Questions about safety, questions about local control or home rule
I
to
wonder
decide.
if zoning, if that initiative passed, just hypothetically, you know, how a zoning ordinance would play into that.
It all depends on how it's written. Because the zoning power is a constitutional power that cities have.
Fascinating. It's fascinating.
And so we'll have to see how the initiative is
Well,
written.
his name is
Right.
Chris McKenzie. He is the executive director of the League of California Cities. My name is Brad Pomerance. We are coming to you from Sacramento, and this is California Edition.